Welcome to this Aslander presentation. Let's explore classic Maya imperialism with Jerald Jerry Eck Romero of Western Washington University. Enjoy.
Um, well, I wanted to first start off by thanking Jim for organizing this and inviting me to present a paper. This presentation is the result of, or it's sort of providing an overview of ideas that I've been kind of kicking around and working through for about 15 years, like since I was working on my dissertation. Um, and that research got focused on Champoton, west coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. But this is kind of providing a broad overview of something that I'm kind of working on publishing in a few articles that will hopefully be out in the near future. Um, One thing I find interesting to think about is to try to think about where we are, like in the broad history of our discipline. So within Maya research, I think you could make a good argument that we might be in the midst of what will be looked back upon in the future as the golden era of Maya archaeology or Maya research. So we have a lot of different sources of information that are providing us with kind of fundamentally new and very interesting kind of views of Maya landscapes and Maya history. So the one that gets mentioned quite often is LiDAR. So there's a lot of projects right now that are using LiDAR survey to map, polity-sized areas. And that's given us an ability to kind of provide a broader kind of regional context for the cities that have predominantly been the focus of Maya research since its origins. Um, the very recent survey at Calakmul, I think, is the one that I'm particularly looking forward to learning more about because it has provided a really kind of unique view of the capital of one of these expansionist Maya polities. Um, I again, I don't want to make predictions too much, but I think that like in the next few decades, we'll probably see LiDAR at fully regional scale, where we're talking about like several hundred square kilometer coverage areas, which will allow us to look at relationships between kingdoms. We also have a lot of advances in dating techniques, especially Bayesian statistical modeling has allowed us to narrow down our chronological phases down to sub-century, and sometimes we're getting close to uh, generational timeframes, which is really exciting. Um, I do although I spent most of my career working in the Maya area, I've been doing research up here in Washington State in the Salish Sea, and our archaeological chronologies up here are millennia to centuries in length. But getting things down to like 50 years or even less in the Maya area provides us with an ability to look at things like economic change and political change, things that are pretty volatile historically. And that's again a really major empirical advancement that we're seeing right now. And then a lot of the really exciting things that are happening right now is that relate to the maturation of the decipherment of Maya, the Maya writing system. So we've kind of moved from understanding the basics to into a time now where we're kind of working out historical synthesis. So this image from Martin and Gruba's book a while back was kind of at the beginnings of that, looking at relationships between kingdoms. And I think right now we're moving into a period where we're basically able to access indigenous Maya views of history, like written by authors at the time who were living through those things, which is really kind of exciting. Um, so I think it's an interesting question. Like, is this the golden era of Maya archaeology? I think that's a fair argument. I think one of the works that I've read more recently is Simon Martin's really amazing book on ancestral politics. And in this book, if you're unfamiliar with this book, I highly recommend it. It is one of the most empirically dense books I've ever read, and I say that in the best possible way. It has so much information, and when I was reading this book, it kind of it really dawned on me that we are kind of moving into a new era where the things that Simon was talking about in this book are historical synthesis with a really high degree of kind of like um, empirical precision. So um, I read an article a few years ago, it was about the same time that Simon's book came out. This sort of was kind of a focus on the history of ideas, particularly relating to classic Maya political organization and how ideas have changed through time. And some of the things I pointed out in that book, or some of the arguments I made in that book, is that there's a few impediments to the development of new ideas about Maya politics. And so we have this huge set of data, a massive amount of information available to us right now. But in this article, I basically argued that we have been slower to come up to theorize new ways of kind of understanding, to accommodate and explain those new data. So some of the things I recommend was kind of moving away from like the notion of the mysterious Maya, these fetishized notions of the Maya past. They're, those are very well reflected in pseudoscientific archaeology, like in the media. And instead kind of focus on, engaging with literature relevant to the issue of political organization, particularly work written by people who are working outside of Maya archaeology and outside of archaeology entirely. And sort of recommit to kind of theory building. Like we have there's kind of a lag right now between the information we have available and the theories we use to make sense of that data. And that's kind of created some contradictions. And again, I think those contradictions kind of reflect the need to step back and kind of develop big picture ideas about Maya political organization. Some of the things I find personally kind of useful for doing so is to kind of focus on what states do. And again, the epigraphic record provides a huge amount of information kind of in that realm. And instead of like just kind of thinking about like ideology, kind of shifting to like what polities do, like what we have reflected in both the archaeological and historic record. I don't mean to pause, but like I'm getting a lot of kind of feedback. I think maybe John Daigle's phone is in his pocket. Not sure if other people are hearing that. Yeah, great. Thanks. So in this paper, I basically kind of identified sort of some issues with political organization and kind of working to supplement that with new kind of ways of making sense of all this information. So some of the things I hope to address in this presentation is the question of whether theories and conceptual frameworks from outside Maya studies, but particularly as well as just outside of anthropology, can aid in the development of more robust models of Maya political organization. This is based on my own kind of experience, like engaging with literature written by archaeologists and as well as literature written outside of anthropology. I find that I have more kind of aha moments when I'm reading work that are further outside our little disciplinary silo. I was going to get into some of those tonight. The second question is do classic Maya political dynamics as reflected archaeologically and epigraphically conform to definitions of imperialism? I've noticed that, again, as we get this increasingly nuanced and kind of growing body of empirical data about Maya political interactions, like interactions between kingdoms, I've noticed that well, a lot of archaeologists are really hesitant to use the I word or the E word, imperialism or empire, to describe these things. I always, to be honest, I always kind of thought that that was strange. So we'll kind of open that can of worms. And then likewise, I wanted to get into the kind of the broader question of like, what are some of the factors that might have influenced the political strategies that were adopted by, you know, the ruling dynasties of different kingdoms, particularly relating to instances where we know kingdoms were exerting direct control over peers. So these are the things we'll kind of get into. First, some kind of just to kind of develop a better conceptual framework. The concept of political organization is so broad to the point where it's sort of hard to address or to kind of use as a framework to develop kind of testable theories. So I think it's useful to kind of make a distinction of two components of political organization that I view as they're not obviously not entirely independent, but they're can be viewed as kind of different realms. The first is governance, like how power works within, you know, what we call a state or a kingdom. So and this gets into kind of, you know, the way that the internal affairs of state. And really, like I kind of one key element of that gets into, you know, issues of political legitimacy, sovereignty, as well as the ways that, you know, kind of ruling regimes created connections with you know, citizens or constituents to kind of create a, you know, ruling regime. On the other side, we have geopolitics, which is the way that independent states interact with one another. So geopolitical interactions are basically interactions between states. So this gets into a lot of times that the concept of anarchy is used a lot in particularly in political science and the subset of political science, international relations, that deals specifically with geopolitical dynamics, which is the way that kind of polities interact with one another. And then until very recently, that was sort of a, you know, a system without, in a lot of cases, without rules. Or at least people have made that argument. It's an interesting thing to talk about. So for dealing with political organization, like if we're trying to kind of adopt a really useful set of concepts that are useful for building theories of classic Maya political organization, I've always found it odd that we don't draw on concepts from the one field that is specifically focused on governance and geopolitics, which is political science. Like poli-sci has existed for a lot longer than anthropology, and they are focused specifically on, you know, these issues. And I've always thought it was kind of remarkable how little archaeologists tend to read works written by political scientists that are directly relevant to the work we do. Some have made the argument that poli-sci only really deals with modern dynamics, but that is, well, that argument doesn't really hold up, and I'll kind of get into some examples of why. Likewise, I think it's useful to kind of think about how you know, how political organization and geopolitics relate to time. So at the kind of at the micro level, we have, you know, the ways that a governing system like you know, a government works, the different kind of the different factions that form a political regime, and how they interact within a broader political landscape. Those geopolitical landscape kind of things tend to be volatile. They change quickly. And if we just look at the last few hundred years of kind of global history, like there's been many instances of, you know, countries forming, breaking up into components, the lines that we use to demarcate, you know, nation states moving around, and you know, most wars kind of deal with, or many wars kind of deal with these issues. And then more broadly, we have geopolitical institutions, which are kind of these more longer lasting And when I say conservative, I mean conservative in the sense that they don't tend to shift quickly. I'm definitely not making like a kind of a political conservative kind of argument, but so institutions are basically a lot of times the the things that two factions who are directly opposed to one another tend to kind of agree upon. They tend to exist for well, a lot of times outlast the history of a state or of a nation. Um, and again, these things get into kind of longer lasting things, longer lasting structures. One set of theory I find really useful to kind of talk about these things, which is like it's useful for politics, but it's also useful for a lot of different kind of human environmental interactions. Is the are concepts from socio-ecological systems theory and theories of adaptive change. And basically this kind of figure eight, I won't get too into the weeds about like what exactly that means, but it's basically kind of cycles of kind of formation, expansion, collapse, and reformation of lots of different types of things. So this could be used to model ecological change or political change or economic change. Those geopolitical landscapes again are volatile, like they're kind of constantly changing, they're moving around. We see the kind of the formation and dissolution of empires within that kind of landscape scale, and then we have these things that kind of exist at like a higher kind of temporal scale that are longer lasting and more over time more durable. And those things do change. Nothing lasts forever, but they do have a fundamentally different temporality. So this figure is kind of designed to kind of show the interaction between short-term, kind of more volatile political dynamics versus longer term dynamics. And some geopolitical institutions would even go into this like most upper level. Um, so to kind of put this landscapes and institutions thing in kind of in context to the Maya, landscapes would kind of the political landscape would kind of relate to things that are happening between kingdoms at any one given time. And that could relate to alliances between kingdoms. These things are reflected by marriage, alliances, and kind of direct statements of kind of affiliation. Whereas institutions would be a lot of the kind of the characteristics that are usually used to define like the pre-classic period versus the classic period. So when we talk about when we use the term the classic period, that's not obviously not an indigenous term. That's a term that outsiders have imposed. But the notion of the classic, like the characteristics we use to define the classic period or relate to divine kingship, certain types of kind of political and economic kind of organizations. And those things existed for centuries until, again, they changed in the post-classic. So, yeah, I hope these concepts are clear because we're going to draw on them, come back to them kind of a few times in this presentation. Um, I mentioned the E word, empire. There's been lots of definitions of empire and imperialism. These are some from a few books that are written by archaeologists about the archaeology of empires. The 2001 was the two quotes here from 2001 are both from the same book, which was, I can't remember what the title is, but it was basically an edited volume on the archaeology of empires. So these there's a lot of overlap in these definitions, but they tend to focus on very, very large states. The notion of an empire is a polity that conquers people of different kind of ethnic or cultural affiliations. But a lot of this kind of gets into, again, kind of size and power. And there's this notion that empires are the most powerful form of the state, kind of drawing on, neo-evolutionary theories of what that term means. I like the one by Morrison from that book, which is, the drawing on Supreme Court, the way that the Supreme Court defines pornography is, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. So he kind of or Morrison mentioned that empires are these things that are difficult to define if we want to come up with an operational definition, but we know them when we see them. And again, I think whenever people are making statements like that, that's kind of highlighting not so much the fact that this is something that's inherently difficult to define. It's just I think an indicator that we need to come up with better operational definitions. And that's kind of, again, weakness of concept, or problems with our operational definitions. Um, so some of the kind of key elements of the way that archaeologists tend to talk about empires. Well, the first is the kind of the use of the Roman Empire as like the prototype. And obviously, the Roman Empire was an empire that existed. It's really kind of a polity that kind of went through various different kind of eras or cycles of expansion. But the, I think in terms of if we want to think about like empires as these types of states that exist along a continuum, I think most of us would agree that the Roman Empire is at one extreme end of that, where it was a quite kind of well, from the perspective of provinces that came under Roman control, a quite invasive state that tended to focus very heavily on like direct forms of imperial control, or at least that's the way we talk about the Roman Empire. In reality, it was actually a lot more kind of variable. But there's this kind of these ideas or these sort of not really so much the way that the Roman Empire was, but the way we think about it as the prototype for imperialism. Um, and components of that is the assumption of direct rulership, that the empires when empires conquer a rival polity, that they incorporate, that they annex that place. And again, with annexation, we're kind of there's this assumption, and this is a modern bias, but the way we tend to think about political organization is through the lens of today, which is a world that is defined by fairly well delineated international boundaries. And again, in the past, that would not have been the way that it is, and that the way that polities worked. But um, these are again some kind of sets of like a lot of these definitions really do fit Rome. Um, and in some cases they have kind of awkward fit with even some things I think most people would agree is very clear. Like if there's an empire is a thing that historical examples that would clearly fit into that, like the Mongol state, and finally, there's definitely some old world, new world kind of biases. Like the term empire is usually applied much more liberally in the Eastern Hemisphere than it is to the West. And again, I think that's a kind of embedded within settler colonialism and the kind of the influence of colonial ideologies. So. I mentioned that political science has existed for a long time. Like where the origins of political science go way back. Obviously, the fields came about. The use of that term for a field came about relatively recently, but we have a long history of scholars thinking about politics and political organization. One of the most oft-cited examples, or as kind of for the origins of political science, is the work of Thucydides, especially his history of the Peloponnesian War. And in that he talks about, or he contrasts and compares the Delian League with Sparta, and those being two different types of polities. In terms of not just how they were organized internally, like governance, but how they interacted with their peers. And with with the formation of the Delian League, Athens was essentially kind of exerting direct control over its peers, whereas with the Spartan hegemony, it was mostly like a military kind of arrangement where what we call like the Spartan hegemony was something that came together in times of war and then kind of relaxed. So again, Thucydides was talking about this 2,500 years ago almost. So a very, very long time ago, and recognizing this kind of distinction between two different types of polities. Julius Caesar wrote about kind of imperialism and kind of how imperialism works. Obviously, he was somebody who was a ruler of the state that we now kind of use as the prototype. And this is kind of the root of that term, the empire and imperium. And he, if you read Caesar and also like works on like kind of Roman history, they talk about not so much territoriality as a goal for imperial expansion, but control over people, control over kind of political networks. So it's not so much a thing you can draw a nice, tidy line around on a map, the way we tend to think about the geopolitical landscapes now, but a something that's more focused on the recognition and exertion of power. Um, Moving closer to now, but still, a very long time ago, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah was a really amazing work, basically like a incredibly intensive, like multi-volume history. And in that work, he talked about empires as having like kind of cycles of expansion and contraction, or expansion and dissolution, and some of the factors that would cause a state to kind of, to grow, to kind of stagnate, and then to disintegrate, and then a new cycle of imperialism to follow. And again, he was writing in the Middle Ages, so 1377, so very, very long time ago. Um, and finally, the last like kind of ancient kind of contribution to this, or at least like contribution that goes back at least a few centuries, is Machiavelli's ideas in The Prince, where he talked a lot about strategies of political domination. And one of the most off-cited kind of parts of that book, he talked about the three ways that a state can control a conquered territory, or a newly basically a newly conquered area. The first is to despoil them, to like exert direct military control. The second is to kind of establish like direct leadership, to go and live there in person. And the third is to allow them to live under their own laws. So basically, kind of co-opting indigenous elites or local elites to kind of maintain control. And again, he's talking about these things almost 500 years ago. So yeah, again, it's the notion that political science is something that relates only to modern politics and international relations is kind of silly, because literally most of the things I've been talking about today um, predate that modern system. But we do have more recent works to draw on. One of the books I find the most useful for just kind of coming up with uh, a operational definition of empire that's workable for archaeological research and epigraphic research is Michael Doyle's book Empires. And this is mostly kind of focused. It's history and political science. But Doyle kind of again identified, basically defines imperialism as one polity, one state kind of violating the sovereignty of a peer. So where one state becomes subordinate to another. Um, and Doyle makes a really important distinction between hegemony, and this is based directly off of the works of Thucydides millennia prior. Hegemony as basically being control of foreign policy. So Thucydides was talking about this in relation to the Spartan hegemony, where Sparta controlled how states within its political orbit interacted with others, but didn't really mess with internal affairs of state at all. whereas imperialism is control over internal affairs of state. And this kind of gets into geopolitical relationships and governance. So really, hegemony is following Doyle, and I think that this is useful because it's um, it can be applied and evaluated using the empirical record we have available to us. That a hegemonic system is basically a system where one kingdom is exerting control over the international affairs of another one, or over the geopolitical interactions of a network of subordinate states, whereas empires will have an impact on the internal affairs, like you know, um, how things work internally. Um, so hopefully this is helpful. We're going to build on these as well. The way that there's a lot of literature that kind of again presents this not so much as hegemony and empire as two types or like a dichotom in a dichotomous kind of framework, but just presenting this as a continuum. Where we have, on one end of the continuum, more indirect forms of political domination, and on the other pole, we have direct forms of political domination. And there's different terms that are used. Again, in political science, they tend to talk about like hegemonies versus empires, patrimonial versus imperial bureaucratic forms of political domination following Eisenstadt, the hegemonic territorial, uh, uh, again, kind of continuum that was used, most initially by Luttwak, and but Ross Hassig applied this to the Aztec state, arguing that the Aztec state was uh, a hegemonic empire. And then empires of domination versus territorial empires. This kind of gets into control over politics, like kind of interpersonal relationships versus control of land. But in reality, even if we're talking about very well documented empires, and again, I think Rome is a good example just because we have such a huge amount of information about it, and it's the most often cited example of a pre-industrial empire. Even within Rome, Rome exerted indirect control over some provinces and direct control over others, and that control extended beyond like places that were, formally conquered by the Roman Empire. And again, we tend to think of the Roman Empire through the lens of maps quite a lot, but in reality, even Rome was using forms of political domination that were more kind of indirect, which we'd usually associate with a more hegemonic type of political strategy versus a more direct form especially in places closer to the kind of the capital. Um, and again, I think that this kind of continuum approach is really a good way of thinking about things because, again, if you look at in cases where we have good documentation, most empires don't tend to adopt like a one size fits all model to control polities that they dominate. Um, Finally, like some other theories from political science that I found really useful is the notion of hegemonic stability and also like the corresponding notion of hegemonic warfare. So this is basically a kind of big history kind of way of thinking about the past or the recent political history is being made up of kind of eras where one polity kind of exerts control over the world. And again, at that point, like the further we go back in past, the further the world is removed from the globe. But during the era of Rome, like Rome controlled, a good chunk of the known world. During the Mongol Empire, same thing. Obviously, there were places outside, but they controlled a large chunk of what was to people's lived experiences, kind of the world. And during those times, you actually get periods of kind of peace and prosperity, which is something that is kind of a conclusion from um, kind of classical political science. So um, and then those periods, like those kind of periods of hegemonic stability, there's in general kind of a century rule that they tend to last about a century. Not always, some will last longer than that. But then there will be a war where um, the empire will be conquered by a rival, and then usually there will be like at that out of that war that you'll either have continuity if the the previously existing state wins, or a total upheaval and the formation of a new geopolitical order. So the term posh again, kind of relating to pox or posh, relating to kind of the origins of this idea with people thinking about the way that Rome works. Um, but basically, this idea that there's kind of periods of stasis where you have relatively geopolitical calm, and then upheaval and rapid change. And again, that kind of ties into that notion of adaptive change I was talking about before, where we have, the establishment of an order, stability, and kind of the basically additions of kind of structures to maintain that, and then the whole thing collapses and then reorganizes uh, into a new system. And we have this kind of constant cycle back and forth. I don't want to talk too much about contemporary politics because I realize that our lives are kind of bombarded by these things all the time. But um, this raises some kind of interesting issues about like, the current system in which the United States has kind of played like a dominant geopolitical role, and what comes next. From hegemonic stability theory, like basically once you get a rival that they will fight, that they will engage in direct military conflict. So yeah, like people have theorized about whether or not the United States has kind of been the waning years of the Pax Americana, and whether or not we'll um, get into a direct shooting war with China as our kind of predominant geopolitical rival is kind of a scary idea, but hopefully not, because that would be debilitating. Um, but anyways, we can kind of think of like these kind of cycles of this being that kind of lower order geopolitical landscape dynamic that I was talking about before. So again, just kind of talk about like history of ideas in the way that people have thought about Maya archaeology. Again, like who are the people who are thinking about these things? Predominantly, most of the literature on Maya political history and political organization is written by outsiders, but see people from the United States and England kind of overrepresented here. We also have, like within the last few decades, the epigraphic record kind of providing this kind of alternative transcript to that, where we have like direct evidence from people who um, were directly involved in those polities and lived through those dynamics. But from the earliest era of Maya archaeology, we have people like Morley and Gann talking about like old and new empires. The old empire being Tikal and the new empire being Chichen Itza. Uh, After that, we see J. Eric S. Thompson kind of become like the dean of Maya research, and his ideas become kind of predominant for a few decades. He viewed the Maya as, well, this is kind of folded in within the vacant ceremonial center model, but basically that Maya polities were decentralized theocracies, that the cities weren't actually urban in nature. They were just kind of ceremonial centers. And that there were most people would have been kind of farmers living out in the hinterland who occasionally went into places to observe a public ritual. In the 70s and 80s, we start to see uh, more centralized theories about Maya political organization, and a lot of these things are that these ideas are coming out of archaeological projects at particularly large centers. So I want to mention the work of Joyce Marcus and William Folan They worked together and kind of compared notes quite a bit. But Joyce Marcus was looking at this from an epigraphic perspective. William Follen was looking at it from an archaeological perspective. First working his work at Koba, where he was working at a very large city with a radial kind of causeway system, kind of connecting it to hinterland communities, and then later at Calakmul, which is it's difficult to quantify now, but like most likely the largest classic Maya city, but also the at least the polity where we have the most direct evidence of expansive exertion of power over a large area. And again, that's not kind of incidental. So the vacant ceremonial center model is most obviously a poor fit for some of those really, really big cities. And as we get more and more archaeological data, people are recognizing that not all cities are the same. That um, places like Tikal and Calakmul are orders of magnitude larger than places like um, Dos Pilas, Yaxchilan, and there's a kind of a range of different city sizes, and presumably that the people are making the argument that city size and kind of area of direct control would have would have correlated with political power. In the 80s and 90s, we see a return of kind of decentralized views. So the peer polity or galactic polity concept. Arthur Demar's work was kind of the most off-sided, but there's a lot of kind of the notion of theater states, or the concepts of charismatic polities. These ideas, these kind of more decentralized views, are still common. And then starting in the mid 90s and kind of continuing on, where we see Simon Martin and Nikolai Gruba's collaboration, and then their kind of independent research kind of focusing on evidence of kind of relationships between kingdoms that kind of reflect these larger political networks. So yeah. And again, there's some conflation here between governance, like the area that was under the direct control of a kingdom, versus the relationships between kingdoms. Simon Martin and Nikolai Gruber were talking about relationships between kingdoms. At least that was the area of their main kind of contribution. But whereas like regional state models, and we're kind of more focused on like internal, like the areas under direct control of a polity. So this polygon for Calakmul, I think, is like the very kind of the most famous figure that ties into that. And Martin and Gruber's kind of I always call it the subway figure, showing interactions between kingdoms as kind of focusing on geopolitics. So yeah. So we have somewhat of a contradiction. So if we look at the available evidence, the evidence available to us, and that's both archaeological and epigraphic evidence, there's very clear data to support the centrality of the individual kingdom as like a durable, lasting political institution. So these are both best reflected by emblem glyphs, distributions of emblem glyphs, and again, each kingdom kind of having a political title that dynasties of kings, or kind of lineages of kings, used over long periods of time. As we get into the maturation of the decipherment of the writing system, we start to see dynastic sequences, and we are understanding like who are the how succession works from an internal perspective. We now know that like in emblem glyphs, it involves a political title, but also like usually a toponym, like something that relates to place. So these are basically the Maya ruling lines, or Maya dynasties, are in many cases tied to place, and it's only the interesting exceptions of when polities move from one place to another that kind of go against that kind of long-term connection between place. And again, we do have kind of, in some cases, multiple emblem glyphs being used, and in some cases, an emblem glyph jumping from one place to another. But that tie to place is literally a component of the title. So Ahalel, as in like an indigenous Maya concept, is that one of those distinguishing characteristics of the classic period, particularly divine kingship, a particular variety of Ahalel, or divine kingship. In Simon's recent book, he talked about this as like a society of kings, of different kingdoms interacting with one another. And this type of dynamic is very common globally in history. Like this is something where we have an incredible amount of comparative examples. This is a book written by, or edited volume, published by Mogens Hansen back 25 years ago. There's actually a book, an edited volume, and then a follow-up. And it was that book is this thick. Like it is a very effective doorstop. So in the first version, it was 30 city-state cultures, and it was talking about city-state organization in multiple kind of many times and places in human history. But one of the really important contributions to this book isn't like just the definition of what a city-state is, but how city-states exist. So historically, city-states exist in clusters, and really the fundamental thing that's interesting about them is that broader kind of interactions between kingdoms. So when we talk about like what Maya means, like that is it's the result of lots of different independent kingdoms constantly interacting with one another, trading with one another, exchanging ideas with one another, speaking the same languages, having same fundamental like ideas about how the cosmos works, having this a kind of shared pantheon of gods and a basic understanding about these kind of deep structures, but being broken up into multiple different kingdoms that are interacting with one another. And this is why we don't really have a glyph for Maya. Again, the notion of the Maya is an anthropological concept or construct. It's an idea that was clearly, if it existed at all, was not terribly important to Maya scribes who were writing about their own history. They were talking about interactions between kingdoms. Nikolai Gruba wrote one of the chapters in this book about the how it applied to the Maya. So this was an area where you know there was a recognition of the use of this concept. Although oddly, again, Mayanists don't tend to cite this book very often, which again I think is strange. The introductory chapter by Mogens Hansen is really useful. Likewise, the pure polity concept was kind of overlapped in some ways. But anyhow, so we do have this clear evidence of this kind of form of organization as a deep structure. However, we have contradictions to that. So again, if city-states were just interacting with one another, we wouldn't expect to see like direct domination of one kingdom of another, or kind of long-term kind of lasting relationships like that. But we do. So although it seems very clear that each kingdom is a sovereign thing and that that's a durable structure that lasts for a long time, like many kind of generations of kings in most cases, we do have shorter term interactions that kind of violate that sovereignty. So some of the epigraphic evidence of this, and again, this is work that like Simon Martin and Nikolai Gruber were really kind of produced a seminal contribution in recognizing these things initially. The Ukabi or Uchabi relationship, where basically one king is sanctioning or overseeing the installation of the ruler of a subordinate kingdom. That's where we get non-local references most often. So Tikal initially, and then Kalakmul shows up in the texts of many, many kingdoms where we have Kalakmul rulers overseeing the installation of a local king. And that's showing up in that subordinate states texts. So they're writing about their own domination or their own subordination to this, this external power. Yichnal is this kind of a similar concept, like in front of or before, like, and again, it's usually the installation of a local king under the supervision of or under in front of before a dominant king. And honestly, like most of the information we have about Calakmul comes from these subordinate kingdoms, just because the texts at Calakmul didn't were it's um they just didn't last. The limestone they used was soft, and we don't have a lot of legible text from Calakmul. But we know a lot about Calakmul through the view of its vassals. So looking at the history of Ukhavi, or this kind of these relationships of kind of witnessing or overseeing, this starts with the Teotihuacan entrada, and basically the Teotihuacan conquest of multiple different kingdoms, but kind of setting up a client kind of state at Tikal, and Tikal basically Teotihuacan affiliated Tikal, expanding control over a large area. So Siak Kak, who is a person who's like, there's a massive amount of information suggesting that he's a person of Teotihuacan origin who's sent to the Maya area to conquer kingdoms. He oversees the accession of a Tikal king. So when Siak Kak arrives, the king of Tikal enters the water. He's that's we don't really know exactly what happened to him, but we have a political marriage, and basically a Yashnu Nain being somebody who is Teotihuacan affiliated, who's but has local roots, and he's acceding to the throne of Mutal, of the Tikal kingdom, under the auspices of this foreign person. And then that sort of kicks off this dynamic. We start to see these things become more and more common through time. Kanul comes a century and a half later, starts doing the same thing and kind of creating its own kind of network, and that's where we get the first like really indigenous Maya geopolitical like hierarchies starting to show up, or at least being well reflected in the epigraphic record. But yeah, so in this case, again, we have Teotihuacan kind of introducing a new political concept into the Maya area that at least we don't have any evidence of it prior to that. Explicit statements of hierarchy. We have kings referring to themselves as, or kings being referred to as the possession of a foreign ruler. So Yahao is like literally a possessed form of lord or king. And in this case, again, a lot of times we have vassals recognizing their own, well, their own status as being possessed by a foreign king. We have many of these with Kalakmul. So we see like a large number of kingdoms that are where their rulers are being described as the ahau of a foreign king. And again, the origins of this is the Teotihuacan entrada. So we have Siak Kak named as the patron, or the possessor of kings from Nachtun, Behukal, Rio Azul, and this becomes kind of something that goes from initially associated with outsiders, with Teotihuacan Teotihuacanos, and becoming more a more used by indigenous Maya kings, and with the decline of Calakmul as a major kind of a major power. And then finally, we have the addition of new political titles to kind of deal with, how do you deal with the problem of how do we describe like a person who dominates a king? So the Kolumte title is the most off-sided one. We don't know the exact reading of it. I saw tree splitter as a potential kind of reading of what this means, but kings start describing themselves as using this title that is again identifying something that's kind of above and beyond just normal kind of kingship. And sometimes those people are using emblem glyphs, so they're basically the sovereigns or kind of the recognized rulers of kingdoms, and sometimes they're not. And again, the first introduction of this goes back to Teotihuacan. So as Teotihuacan is expanding this empire, Again, we don't use a lot of times don't talk about Teotihuacan as an empire. That's becoming more common now, but it wasn't that long ago where Mike Smith wrote an article kind of making an argument for a Teotihuacan empire. Um, but anyways, we have Teotihuacanos first kind of using this, so the Ochtin columnate or like Western columnate, and kind of tying it to geography. So Siatkak again, as a conqueror, is using this title, and then we start to see it become used by indigenous Maya rulers in time after in later eras. One really interesting thing, and this is something that Simon Martin talked a lot about in his book, was how like at the once Kalak Mul ceases to be like a major power, there's kind of an ensuing era, kind of geopolitical chaos, and we start seeing outsiders come in and using that title again, where they're not they do not have claim to Ahalel or Kuhul Ahalel, this thing that is an indigenous thing that is based on dynasty and descent, but they're using the term Columte. So long, yeah, the evidence suggests that a columte is basically associated with like a conqueror or basically a person who takes control of a place. And that person can be a divine king or not. So we have this kind of separation between this long-lasting institution of Ahalel and we have this distinction between this long-standing institution of Kuhul Ahalel, or kind of divine rulership, versus these things that are clearly reflecting kind of bigger picture stuff. And if we look at these on maps, these are very incomplete maps just because the data is moving so fast. I frankly kind of find it hard to keep up with, but we have um, an era of Tikal affiliated or Teotihuacan affiliated Tikal. We could probably just talk about this as a Teotihuacano kind of state initially. With the decline of Teotihuacan, we actually see like continuity in ideas and kind of the memory of Teotihuacan. So talking about like it's kind of difficult to talk about like when Teotihuacan control ended because kings are talking about that for centuries after the fact. We have places that are clearly kind of directly controlled uh, by Tikal under the auspices of Teotihuacan. And in the center, like around Tikal, we get kingdoms that a lot of times are not using that full emblem glyph. There's not the Kuhul prefix or the holy kind of element to it. Nikolai Gruben made the argument that those toponymic emblem glyphs where it's just Lord of Place um, was a like reflecting a lower order kind of uh, status. But we tend to see those around like the core areas of these bigger polities. So around Tikal in the early classic period, in the middle classic period, we get vassals around Kalakmul. With after the shift of the Kanul state from Zibanche to Kalakmul, we see a group of kingdoms around in the immediate political orbit of Kalakmul who are using these kind of toponymic emblem glyphs, at least for a time, and their histories are so intricately tied to the capital that it's almost again that the notion that Joyce, Marcus, and Willie Folan presented the idea that they presented back in the 70s and 80s, 90s, that this was a regional state, kind of highlights the relationship between an imperial capital, like a metropole with areas in its immediate political orbit, and then we get different dynamics with more distant polities. So these are some of the areas where we have direct evidence of colloquial control. Again, this is not an exhaustive map. Yeah, made this a few years ago. It needs an update. So Kanul dominates, basically exerts direct control throughout much of the 7th century, where we have many kings recognizing their subordination. Literally, Kanul kings are overseeing the installation of rulers all over the Maya area. Um, and that dynamic exists for a little over a century until we have a major war between Tikal and between Mutal and Kanul that results in a Kanul defeat. And at that point, that state or that network of polities that were under the direct control or were under the hegemony of Kalak will start to break apart. Again, this is a figure from Simon's book where I kind of put in kind of some of these moments of introduction of new kind of structures. But it's really not until the arrival of Siak Kak that we start to see evidence of kingdoms controlling other kingdoms or conquering other kingdoms. We get indigenous, like non-Teotihuacan affiliated examples of this, not about a century later. And then that 600, 590 moment is where we get a few defeats by Tikal and Tikal subordinates, and a lot of Tikal subordinates switch affiliation to Kanul at that point. So, and that's where we start to see Kanul kind of become this kind of major political player. I want to tie this into the notion of like hegemonic stability and hegemonic warfare, where we have a period where Teotihuacanos basically introduce imperialism into the Maya area. We see direct control of polities over other polities that exists for, a few generations. And then there's an upheaval, or there's a rise of a rival, direct conflict or conflict between vassals, and then dissolution of that previous system and the replacement of it with a new kind of Kanul dominated network that exists for, again, a handful of generations. Once Kalakmul suffers the defeat from Tikal, and the Kanul dynasty kind of recedes as a major geopolitical player. Start to see all sorts of different things taking place. I don't want to get too in the weeds because I could kind of talk about this a lot. Again, Simon's book, I think, outlines the details in a way that is, unique, in terms of its empirical contribution. But after that time, we see localized warfare, and the Column-Te title is being used by people like almost at a regional level. There's some interesting, it's interesting to consider whether or not the meaning of that term is eroded to some degree within the political chaos that unfolded in the vacuum after the Kanul state kind of recedes as this kind of major kind of geopolitical force. And we also start to see outsiders kind of coming in, like people from the Gulf Coast. It seem like they're from the Gulf Coast using the Column-Te title. I spent a lot of time working at Champotone and did a lot of work with Carlos Payan, who's an epigrapher. He did a really amazing study of the epigraphic record at Edsna, like the political history of Edsna, at the same time that I was working in Champotone, and our data kind of dovetailed together really nicely, where at the time where there's evidence of Kalakmul kind of exerting control over that area, we see regional like settlement patterns within Champotone, and spheres of ceramic affiliation kind of change. And then at the end of Kanul hegemony, after that hegemonic war at the end of the 7th century, things change dramatically. And particularly there's a kind of an influx of influence from the coast, from the Gulf Coast. This is kind of showing basically control of polities that lead along the Rio de Desempeño up through the Edsna Valley and the Rio Champotone. Is kind of like one area, probably providing access out to the Gulf Coast. There's similar network through Moral Reforma Likewise, Marcello Canuto and colleagues have talked about a kind of a royal route. So this is a map from an article by Marcello Canuto and Tomas Barrientos showing kind of a control of like colloquial control of a network of vassals going all the way down to Cancun as kind of like a control of a trade route. There seems to be an eastern kind of um, uh, um, expansion as well. Sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit too. We also see colloquial surrounding Tikal with vassals to kind of create a buffer around Tikal. These are things that were recognized a long time ago. So we have control of kind of trade routes and kind of access to um, communication and the routes that were used to move goods and ideas and people, but also kind of buffering enemies with or surrounding enemies with vassals as a means of political control. Um, so, in summary, like what are some of the I should say in summary, to kind of make sense of all this, I think it's useful to kind of ask what are some of the factors that might have played a role in this tendency towards uh, direct and indirect forms of political domination by classic Maya kings or some classic Maya kings over subordinates. I think it's also useful to think about like whether or not this is kind of a Mesoamerican pattern. In that initial superstates article by um, Simon Martin and Nikolai Gruber, they kind of made the comparison with the way that the Aztec Empire worked, which is kind of a natural uh, comparison to make. So there's a question of whether or not this is just something that has like deep Mesoamerican roots, or likewise it could just have there could be other factors besides just this kind of long-lasting tradition. Interestingly, the way that from what we know about the way that Teotihuacan exerted control over central Mexico, it doesn't really fit that kind of hegemonic pattern that Ross Hassig talked about. So if it is a Mesoamerican pattern, there's um, clearly exceptions. The Perpetua state from Western Mexico is also doesn't really fit that. But yeah, I wanted to kind of whenever we're in a conceptual conundrum, we have trouble understanding things. I think it's useful to reach out to our political science, our colleagues in political science. So this is an article that was written by Gehring et al. About almost 15 years ago, and it's called An Institutional Theory of Direct and Indirect Rule. And they did a kind of this is um, it drew on historical examples from along a pretty extensive breadth of time, and also looked at a lot of dynamics that existed in different places, and they basically kind of went through different theories of imperialism, like basically the how decisions over which imperial strategy is favored by a state in different contexts. Basically, they went through different theories like that had been presented and kind of classified them and applied those theories to a very large set of data and kind of came up with some interesting uh, conclusions. So I'm sorry for all the text on this slide. This is way too much text, but just kind of starting from the top. 1 and 2 here, the access hypothesis and the power hypothesis, is basically the notion that empires will exert the most direct form of rulership of political control that's within their means. So the access component kind of gets into spatial proximity. So like an empire will exert direct control over places closer to the core and more indirect forms of political control further away. The power hypothesis just gets into like the ability. So like basically if an empire could exert direct, highly invasive control over the entire world, they would, but there's limits to their power to do so. So whether or not it's militarily and logistically possible. The revenue and agenda-centered hypothesis kind of gets into like these would be like ideas that people who govern those polities would decide upon. So the revenue hypothesis is the notion that empires will expand to basically broaden their tax base. Um, the agenda-centered one will kind of is sort of a similar, I think the revenue hypothesis is a form of agenda, but again, an agenda centered hypothesis gets into like a specific plan that's put into place. And this kind of gets into a lot of times uh, cites Rome as an example that basically the idea of empire that was existed within Roman kind of society caused Rome to expand just to expand the empire. But yeah, the difference identity hypothesis is the one that's kind of the most interesting. So I'll get to that in a second. But the normative hypothesis kind of gets into cultural traditions. That's also kind of drawing on the notion of that states that have a concept of empire will tend to expand and annex as opposed to just adopt more indirect forms of imperialism. Likewise, there's this notion that the degree to which sovereignty is like a deeply embedded political institution would be an impetus or like a would tend to mitigate the ability or like minimize the ability of a state to expand. The democratic hypothesis, won't spend time on that, but the difference identity hypothesis basically just gets into the notion that a state will exert direct control over a polity if there's deeply embedded cultural differences and institutional differences between the conquering polity and the conquered polity, between the metropole and the vassal. And that essentially the more different the culture of the place that's been conquered and the political institutions and kind of the forms of governance that are used in that conquered place, the more likely the empire is to put their own people in control. So this is a difference between co-opting locals versus sending a person from, like if you conquered an area like Rome, sending a Roman to be the governor of a newly conquered province. So this difference identity hypothesis is interesting. So again, most of these four are kind of the ones that we tend to hear about archaeologists talking about. So like a lot of arguments for like why the Maya didn't exert more direct forms of political domination is because they couldn't. It was too far. They didn't have standing armies. They didn't have institutions to be able to kind of facilitate that. And again, that's sort of a kind of a circular argument. Uh, Likewise, the kind of the revenue or agenda centered hypothesis is basically that it wouldn't have been in their best interest to do so. The difference identity hypothesis, again, I think that this is something that's really useful for city-state cultures. So in a city-state culture, you have a bunch of independent kingdoms that all have shared fundamental ideas about the way the world works. A lot of times they're speaking the same language or closely related languages. They have similar political institutions. They have similar ways of doing things. Their economies are kind of, they've been interacting with each other for some time. And then when one of those kingdoms conquers another one, there's basically not a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of translate that to this new set of dynamics. So in this case, again, the reason why we talk about the Maya as a thing is because there are these clear evidence of shared cultural traits that that kind of existed across what we call the Maya area. And therefore, again, because we have these kind of similar fundamental ways of doing things and kind of shared cultures that are the fundamentally what we're talking about when we use the term Maya, that would lead to less direct forms of rulership. That's something we see with the Aztec state as well, like as the Triple Alliance and later mostly like the Mexica were expanding out. They were conquering other city states that had a lot in common with them, and they were leaving the kings of those places on the throne to kind of oversee a lot of internal affairs unless it became a problem. And for the Maya, they seem to have adopted a similar thing. Instead of Calakmul sending out uh, people from Kanul or people from the polity to go rule over places, they're a lot of times leaving, like maintaining the ruling dynasty of the new vassal and allowing them to kind of oversee, affairs of state. That said, those new polities are kind of beholden to the metropole to literally for their own political legitimacy. So again, with this political this seeming contradiction, because we have this society of kings and these kingdoms that have a lot in common culturally, um, you're able to add a layer of political, well, hierarchy above that. It does require some new concepts like Ukabi, Yahao, Kalumte to explain those things. Um, but there's still this respect for and kind of deference to Kuhul Ahalel as this long existing thing. Even with Teotihuacan, when Teotihuacan sent Siak Kak to conquer multiple polities in the Maya area, that person was not able to claim divine kingship. So Siak Kak never took the title of Kuhul Mutal Ahau, because that would not have been a legitimate statement. That would have gone contrary to the fundamental nature of that institution. The Teotihuacans were able to marry a local woman to a spear thrower owl, and the result of that marriage was a person who had Teotihuacan links, but connections to that ruling dynasty, and that person was able to claim the 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 title of divine king of Mutal. Um, but we see these addition of these extra dynamics on top of it. So in terms of the question of like, is imperialism in evidence here? Again, going back to the way Doyle talked about it, we definitely have control over like of um, uh, external like international relations. When Kalakmul establishes a political network, members of that network are very rarely fighting with one another. Same thing with Tikal or Teotihuacan affiliated Tikal. They're kind of controlling the geopolitical interactions of their vassals. So we definitely have the establishment of these political networks. They last about at least a century, and they're pretty durable. They're lasting. Um, but they're not as long lasting as these more kind of, again, fundamental political institutions. Likewise, we also see control over internal affairs. So basically the sanctioning of kings. And that's something that I think that's an area where we need more research. Like to what degree um, did becoming a Kanul vassal impact Naranjo or Perikal or these other places that we have very strong evidence that they came under Kanul control? Like what were the actual impacts of those to internal affairs or affairs of governance? Um, the sanctioning of the kings kind of highlights that for a vassal king to accede to the throne, they needed Kalakmul kind of sanction. I think that that's a pretty well evidenced in the record because those subordinate kingdoms are describing themselves as vassals themselves. This is not kind of political propaganda coming from outside. Um, Finally, I'll leave off with this. This is work that I've been working on with Carlos Payan, where we're trying to kind of pull this kind of ideas of about like um, longer term eras defined by political institutions with kind of the more kind of volatile cycles of expansion and contraction of uh, of of um, of empires. And again, if we want to call them hegemonic empires, that's fine. Um, but anyways, it's kind of breaking down the classic period. We tend to when we develop chronological frameworks, we tend to use them or to overextend them. But really, like in terms of a late classic and early classic, it's more useful to think of like early, middle, and late. Early classic being the era of Teotihuacan kind of dominance. The middle classic being associated with the dominance of Calakmul, and then kind of the late or terminal being the kind of the aftermath of the breakdown of that dynamic. And then later on, we have Chichen Itza, the Mayapan Confederacy, these other things kind of coming up in later eras. It's a really interesting question whether or not a lot of the things I've been talking about were also taking place at places like El Mirador previously. We just don't have epigraphic evidence from that place to make that argument right now. But El Mirador is orders of magnitude larger than most other cities, and it seems to have this kind of lasting political relevance. So, I mean, I think it's, I wouldn't be surprised if we kind of, in the next, few generations discover that similar things were taking place at El Mirador, and this even goes back to pre-Teotihuacan, Entrada eras. But the one thing we do know is like epigraphically, we do see a correlation between the Entrada, the 378 kind of arrival of Teotihuacanos and the introduction of these new kind of political, these new ways of talking about political dominance and subordination. So, and again, like drawing on, like if we're going to use the term empire for the Aztec state, for the Delian League, for most of the empires that existed in Mesopotamian history, those are also city-state cultures where we have the similar types of kind of political dynamics between kingdoms, similar temporalities of empire. But again, there's a kind of remarkable consistency in the way that this tends to happen historically. So yeah, that is my answer to the empire question is that it seems strange for us to not use that term for the Maya. If nothing else, out of the interest in conceptual consistency or consistent application of concepts. So that is all I have to show in terms of slides. Should I stop sharing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Well, that was very good, Jerry. It seemed to be well researched, and that was a really nice, well put together PowerPoint. I don't see any questions right now in the chat, although the chat is the first time I've seen it this way. If it's going to always be like this, I don't like it. I'm used to, I always individually welcome everybody and thank them for being here. And I'm used to seeing that in a long list. And then if somebody does ask a question, there's the question. And then here's another question. But this is very strange. But this person, so there's this little message. Due to the large number of participants in this meeting, system messages for those who joined or left have been disabled. But now one's coming in from unknown. But the questions from this person earlier, something to do with when you were talking about population density, they made a comment that they see less population density, and how does that affect your findings? And then the other second follow-up was a little bit strange because they were asking, do you think it's the lack of horse transport? And how does that affect your findings? That was really strange. But let me read Anon's here. I've heard that there has been a recent reevaluation of some of the Kunul snake emblem glyphs at different cities, and is not necessarily reflecting affiliations to Calakmul. Maybe this is me misstating the hypothesis, perhaps that it was different dynasties trying to assert their own authority by claiming that title. If true, does that change any of the frameworks and dynamics discussed tonight? And hopefully this isn't an especially niche hypothesis, and Dr. Romero knows what I'm talking about.
I'm not. I'm unclear what source is being referenced. I've never seen anybody make the argument that anywhere besides Zibonche or Kalakmul was using the snake emblem glyph, like claiming it as their own. And that's just the shift of like what the Simon Martin and Christoph Helmke and a bunch of other folks have written about the transition of the Kanul dynasty from Zibonche, which is like the original. The term Kanul means the place of the snake, so like the snake place. The snake place was Zibonche, or at least that seems to be the best explanation right now. Folks working at El Mirador have made the argument that that was the original origins of the snake dynasty. Again, that's there's very clear evidence that the Kanul emblem originated at, and that like the toponymic element of that the part that relates to place is rooted in Zibonche, and that there was a schism within the Kanul dynasty, basically part of that ruling dynasty relocated to Kalakmul and then started conquering out. And there's a lot of interesting things going on with like what happened when that schism took place, and there was a lot of kind of reshuffling of political alliances. I've never heard of anywhere besides those two places, or maybe El Mirador, if you include like Richard Hansen in particular has been really kind of advocated that El Mirador was the original origins of the Kanul dynasty. I've never heard of other polities using that, and that would be like, again, like there's very little evidence of like kind of contested use of the same emblem. It does happen, so like Dos Pilas being an offshoot of the Mutal dynasty, but in general, like we don't have basically we don't have contradicting sources from two polities about how these things generally work. That's a more broadly interesting thing. Like the one thing I think is really kind of amazing is that out of all the information we have from many, many different kingdoms now, there's very few evidence of like conflicting reports of the same war, or conflicting reports of like, of basic historical events. So yeah, so like I'm not really sure like those glyphs, like oh, I should mention Kanul emblem glyphs show up at other polities regularly. Like I think there's hundreds of references now. Like there's many, many of them. But that's always a local king exceeding under like recognizing their own subordination to a foreign ruler, or the king of Kalakmul visiting another polity. So there's like there's Kanul kings showing up, playing the ball game at different places, and those are usually again, it's visits by the basically the emperor. Sounds, even for me, it seems weird to use that term, to a vassal kingdom. And the rulers of those vassal kingdoms are really going to extreme lengths to recognize their own subordination and kind of links to this dominant kingdom. The epigraphic record at La Corona, I think, is the best example. Like La Corona is basically a record of local rulers' relationships with Kanul. They're so intertwined, and when Kanul starts to recede as a geopolitical power, the record at Canquin kind of goes quiet. So yeah, so like I've never heard anybody make the argument that those Kanul, the appearance of the Kanul emblem glyph at other sites is people attempting to kind of usurp that or use that as their own. But if they're, if you see something like that, I'd post a link. I'd really like to take a look at that.
He does mention that he's not been able to look into the publications on it yet, so he can't cite anything in particular.
Yeah.
But Joey says, great presentation. I see a parallel with the Roman Empire and their vast roads they used to assert control and allow travel and trade throughout. The same could be said for the Maya causeways connecting all city states.
Yeah, it could be. One of the interesting thing about sock-based systems, most of the inner polity ones, like the ones that connect different cities together, a lot of those are actually pre-classic. So, like El Mirador has an expansive network of roads connecting it to other presumably kingdoms. Again, at that during that era, we don't really know like what political titles were being used. But like El Mirador is connected to multiple different cities. And and those are really like those were documented before LiDAR and they're, being added to now that we have this new source of information. Um, so there are some exceptions like Caracol has a really like a expansive radial sock-based system, but that's really kind of connecting the city of Caracol to like subordinate kind of communities, and those causeway termini are seem to be more like infrastructure moving people that live within like the Kalakmul king's area of direct control. There are causeways around Kalakmul, and I'm really interested to see like what the LiDAR data kind of add to the distribution of those. Like there were causeways around Kalakmul that were documented back in like the 80s, 90s from satellite data. Some of them you can see them from like just visually from an airplane. But Catherine Reese Taylor and Armando Anaya and like there's a big project at Kalakmul, Deborah Walker, and they did a big LiDAR survey, and the results of that are just starting to come out. So it'll be interesting to see if like Kalakmul physically connected itself to vassals, but it doesn't seem like it like that seems to be like more of a pre-classic and in some cases a post-classic thing. In the post-classic, we see a return to that kind of connecting to polities as like a physical manifestation of some relationship. So the Koba causeway being the best example between Koba and Yashuna. But um, yeah, it seems like I wonder whether or not these things were also like related to waterways. There's a lot of features out in what's now the interior Maya lowlands that are like seasonal, like kind of seasonal waterways, like the Desempeño and some of these other waterways. Like I wonder if there were, especially out in Champotón, like the Edzna area, there was canal features that have been found. So I wonder how much transport via water would have been kind of important. But yeah, it's an interesting question. And roads are one of those very, very obvious physical manifestations of these two cities. These two places have a relationship. But in the classic period, they tend to be a little bit more kind of localized.
Yeah. Yeah, Deborah Walker seems to be at Calakmul now, and she's posting almost daily posts. They're
Yeah.
especially uh, investigating on the household level.
Yeah, that's a really big, really interesting project. So it's that they have a great team of people. So like so yeah, Deborah Walker, Catherine Reese Taylor, Armando Anaya, oh geez, who else? Nick Dunning, uh, Veronica Vasquez. There's a lot of really talented people working there.
And doesn't Deborah work more with the ceramics?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. But they did a big LiDAR survey, and the results of that are going to be,
Yeah.
yeah, the very beginning of that, the dissemination of that data has started, and it's yeah, very interesting.
Uh, does anybody want to unmute and ask a question?
Yes.
All right. Dr.
I
Nick.
wanted, well, first of all, it's a very educational lecture. It's good to hear new concepts about the classic Maya. But I wanted to point out, of course, the Teotihuacan, we all understandably focus on Tikal, Washington, and those sites. But I'd like to point out that Yasha has the largest carved frontal monument of Tlaloc warrior anywhere in the Maya lowlands and possibly anywhere in Mesoamerica. There's no hieroglyphs associated with it. And the other thing is, this is from my work in the 1970s. FLAR was founded in 1969 to map Yasha because I knew that Tlaloc stela was there. And we dug up the base of it. The Carnegie only knew the upper part, but they didn't know where the base was. And we found that the base faced the Acropolis behind it. In other words, this monument was not facing the people. It was facing an entire Acropolis with structure 216, where you watch the sunset. So my always question has been, is some amazing Tlaloc Teotihuacan burial somewhere inside there? We were mainly interested in mapping. I'd also like to point out that there are two areas of Yasha that have streets and avenues. They're very short, they're not very long, but they're two completely different parts of the site that have suspicious, we called them a via, because we didn't want to, outrightly claim that they were Teotihuacan, but almost certainly they're related. And we found one tablero talud structure, and there are probably a lot more. So again, Yasha is usually at most only mentioned, but that Tlaloc monument is gigantic. And the fact that it was still standing the entire time, it wasn't buried, it was still standing when Yasha was abandoned, but it was facing away from everybody, facing the pyramid. It was only about a third of the way up.
Yeah, there around Yasha there are a few other places where there's the documentation of like the passage of Siat Kak like into the Central Mile Lowlands. I think that the project sorry, I've been talking all day. My brain's starting to gum up a little bit. But the Francisco Estrada work, like his project, that they had found like a couple of other examples of kind of Entrada references and murals. So I feel like the more we look around, the more we find this stuff. But I think that this kind of goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, which is the inertia of old ideas. I think that when we get happy with the way we think about things and get presented with contrary data, there's this tendency to just kind of explain it away. So it's like, oh yeah, it's Teotihuacan, like the emulation of stuff, or that these relationships between kingdoms we have evidence for are just visitations or kind of connections between kings that don't reflect dominance and subordination, despite the fact that from an epigraphic perspective, it literally states that. With the it's kind of interesting now to see like the huge amount, like I shouldn't say a huge amount, but there's a lot of focus now on like the the impacts of Teotihuacan's exertion of control over the Maya area and like the expansion of the Teotihuacano Empire down into the Maya lowlands. But it took 25 years between the publication of David Stewart's The Arrival of Strangers article to now. Like it takes a long time. We're not very nimble with our ideas. We're very nimble with creating new data, but we're not very nimble with forming new ideas to help explain those data. So, yeah.
Alrighty. Well, once again, thank you, Jerry. Thanks for watching this That Slander program. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Atslander Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at jimreadmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again.